Hello, everyone, and welcome to Stony Brook Southampton's first Sea to Soil Summit. We have an amazing lineup of speakers today, but even more impressive, actually, is our audience. And when I looked at the list of people attending, it was just really fabulous to see the number of organizations that are represented, as well as some of the university departments. So my name is Judy Ann Carmack Fayez, and I am the Director of Food Lab Education. Sort of a dream job for me. I get to create educational programming around food and agriculture. I've been an advocate for education or agricultural education on Long Island for a while, sort of bugging Assemblyman Fred Thiel and Legislator Bridget Fleming and Commissioner Ball, saying that there is no agricultural education on the secondary or post-secondary level. There are great programs here and there. There are some courses, but a lot of the agricultural education has been exported to schools upstate. And I feel like it's really important for us to have a physical location where we can convene, talk, discuss, educate, and train our young folk and people in transition so that they stay here on Long Island and that we have people who are knowledgeable in our fields and in our industries to actually work here. So I'm really thrilled to be here, and I'm going to look to a lot of you out in the audience to work with us to create this programming. I'm sure that many of you have participated in the Food Lab Conference that Jeffrey Drummond, our Executive Director, Jeffrey, has created, and I know I went to those conferences and saw the local talent that we had, the knowledge base, and would say that this is a class, this is a workshop. We have so many people with incredible experience right here, all of you, and I really look forward to working with a lot of you in the future. So when I did come to Stony Brook, I was intent upon, renovating the garden and getting the greenhouse going. And I soon found out that the garden was being used by SOMAS, the School of Marine Sciences, Marine and Atmospheric Sciences. And they were doing some really cool experimentation using kelp fertilizer on vegetables. And I was just like, oh, this is really fabulous. Then I found out that SOMAS was also using the greenhouse to dry kelp. So not only did I want to collaborate, I also realized I had to cooperate. So what I want to say is that you're all wonderful, and I would love for you to spend some time after all the speakers have gone, and spoken, and spend some time outside talking to each other, because it's really collaboration and communication that's going to make all of our objectives and goals go further faster, okay? And I really see that as the future of Food Lab as well, is to be that convening place here. So I learned about this, that SOMAS was involved, and I decided I should call my old buddy Sean Barrett, with whom I had done 2 projects before. One was when I worked with Slow Food. We did Celebration, which really celebrated the local fishermen and women and the fishing industry out here with a big event out in Montauk. And then the second project I worked with Sean on was the Fish Burger project, which really brought fish into schools for the first time. And these fish burgers were made from mostly bycatch, or at least, 40% bycatch, more or less, yeah. So we were able to teach students from elementary through high school all about sustainable seafood, sustainable fishing, and it was remarkable because we were working with a lot of local chefs who brought toppings for the burger from products that came from our local farms. So It was Sean's idea. Sean said, hey, why don't we have a seed to soil symposium? And I was like, yeah, this is great, because I'm not a subject matter expert by far. I don't know anything, and I'm as interested in hearing about what everyone has to say as all of you, I'm sure. Kelp is not a new product, even though in the Long Island Regional Economic Council report, they talk about it as a new product, along with cannabis. It's kelp and cannabis. But kelp predates human existence, and it's been used by indigenous peoples around the world for millennia. It's not a new product, but it is one perhaps for some of us. And there's just 2 points that I want to make before I pass on this podium to Chris Gobler. And that is, I think it's really important for us as a culture and community to embrace indigenous knowledge and indigenous practices. And again, I hope that's something that we can do here at Stony Brook Southampton, just by virtue of the fact that indigenous knowledge is really about knowing how the world works and being observant about flora and fauna, and not trying to be part of it and work with it and understand it, I think is pretty novel for us in some ways. You know, we really believe that, you know, the individual has the right to do what they want. And just one example is, you know, people have their own property, their own house. They think that if they're afraid of ticks and mosquitoes, rightfully so perhaps, that it's okay to spray, and it's okay if it's organic. And people, you know, want green lawns, and they don't want, you know, weeds or moles and voles or crabgrass. And they use herbicides, pesticides, and synthetic fertilizers. Well, yes, you might have a great lawn, and you might have that right to do that, but the effects go way beyond the individual space. It affects the waters, the bays, the flora, the fauna, your neighbors, your animals. And we have Edwina Van Gaal here to speak about that, and I'm really glad that we have the Shinnecock kelp farmers here to talk about that as well. The last thing I want to say is, some of you know that I'm an ex-high school teacher, and part of what I would always do is give my little words of advice and a little tidbits of knowledge that are very valuable that aren't necessarily subject related. But this one today is, I think everybody should be impeccable with their word, the same way that your chemicals can affect bays and other flora and fauna. Your words can affect other people, other businesses, communities, industries. And so I think we have to be really mindful sometimes about what we say and how that might affect you know, other people. I'll keep it simple. And I'm glad that we have Michael Ciaramella here today to talk about the New York Sea Grant Task Force. So that is what I have to say, and I am going to introduce Dr. Chris Gobler, and I have to say I have to read it because he has accomplished so much, and we're so lucky to have him. If you haven't heard the State of the Bays, or if you haven't heard Dr. Gobler speak, you're in for a good treat. So Dr. Christopher Gobler is a professor at the School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences. He received his Master of Sciences and his PhD from Stony Brook University. I won't give the date. And he began his career at LIU, so you've been here for quite the while. In 2014, he was appointed as the Associate Dean of Research at SOMAS, and in 2015, he was named co-director for the Center for Clean Water Technology. The major focus of his research is investigating how anthropogenic activities such as climate change, eutrophication, I don't know what that means, you'll have to expand, and the overharvesting of fisheries alter the natural biochemical and ecological functioning of coastal ecosystems. So without further ado, Dr. Chris Gobler.
No, it's running on its own. Wonderful. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good to see everybody. Happy Earth Day, as it turns out, and welcome to Stony Brook Southampton. I was just actually on main campus at what they call Earthstock at the university, and had the pleasure of speaking there. And you may or may not know, the mascot of Stony Brook University is the seawolf. And so I'm rebranding the seawolf today as the Seawolf Defender of Water. And I can do that. It's a mythical creature, so that's what it stands for me, is the Defender of Water. So I'm just going to give a brief overview here about some water issues and some solutions. We'll thank everybody in my lab. We have some of the members there. Raise your hand, every guys over there who are doing all the hard work in the lab and making all this happen. So just to start out, start with the concept of the watershed. We live on Long Island. The whole island is a watershed. So anything we're doing on land is affecting what's happening. Importantly, in the water below our feet, our aquifer, that's our drinking water source. And so it doesn't get more important than that. And no matter where your water comes from, some people will say, oh, I have city water, so it doesn't matter. If you have city water, it's from Suffolk County Water Authority, most likely, or some other water district, and it's probably just a few miles, comes from a few miles from where you are, if not even closer. So it never comes from far, and so anything, as we just, Julianne just alluded to, anything happening locally is going to affect that water supply. And what we don't extract to actually drink ourselves gets discharged into surface waters and can have a huge impact on those surface waters, transforming ecosystems very, very quickly. So it serves a dual role, and therefore on both fronts it's super important to protect. And we know on Suffolk County and of course Long Island and New York in general, population has grown, continues to grow, and that exacts a toll on our water, specifically our groundwater. And you can see on the right there how the concentrations of nitrogen in groundwater are rapidly changing, and that can have a big effect on human health. I won't talk about that today, but certainly also has an effect on coastal ecosystems. And we know all that nitrogen from land to sea is coming primarily from wastewater and from fertilizer. The studies have been done, and we know that, so that's the link between people and the nitrogen. And we know how that can affect surface waters. So this is a map my lab put together. It represents 2022, just the months between June and September. And essentially what it shows are areas across all of Long Island, as you can see, all the way from Montauk all the way into New York City, that experience some sort of water quality impairment. In most cases, it's what's known as a harmful algal bloom, but in other cases, it's low oxygen. Of course, all marine life outside of bacteria needs oxygen to survive, so it's changing coastal ecosystems, and in some cases, even fish kills, which I'll outline. But harmful algal blooms are the big one. These occur in marine waters, fresh waters. There are the variety that are toxic. There are the variety that can be harmful to ecosystems. For those of you not paying attention, there's actually currently 4 different shellfish bed closures across Long Island right now. The most recent was issued yesterday. So there are 3 locations. All of Flanders Bay and all tributaries to the west are closed to shellfishing because of an outbreak of a harmful algal bloom. The same is true for Jockey Creek and the adjacent creek and the North Fork. And the eastern half of Shinnecock Bay is also closed to shellfishing, all because of one of these harmful algal blooms. On the one hand, it's a natural phenomenon, it's a seasonal phenomenon, but on the other hand, we also know that these things are exacerbated by excessive nitrogen. Each location where we go that I just described, those are areas that when you do the math, the amount of nitrogen coming into the volume of water body, that amount of nitrogen coming in is quite high. Beyond those harmful algal blooms, I'm just going to point out another I won't call it an emerging issue, but a troubling issue that particularly happened last summer, where we had more than 50 different individual fish kills occur in the northwest corner of Long Island. They also were spread in the South Shore as well. But this is something that wasn't too surprising, not fun to look at, but these are areas that experience very low levels of oxygen. Now, this occurs for 2 reasons. One, we live, as we all know, in an era of climate change. The warmer water gets, the less oxygen it naturally holds. And our summers have been warming at a rate that are 2 to 3 times the global average. And so as we get warmer and warmer in summer, there's less oxygen in water. And then in addition, all those algal blooms that I described before, as they decay, they also rob the surface waters of oxygen. Last summer, we just did some experiments looking all over Long Island, trying to understand can we make that definitive link between nitrogen, oxygen, and algal blooms? So we did these studies, 25 locations. I won't bore you with the methods, but we'll just say that they were rigorous to look at what affects algal blooms, what affects oxygen conditions. And I'm not going to go through, I'm just going to go through very quickly of the 25 sites, what we found. So in every case, all 25 locations, nitrogen gave us more algal blooms. For those of you who are into statistics, 92% of the locations, there was a statistically significant increase in algal blooms from the nitrogen. When it came to the decreases in oxygen, every single location, more nitrogen gave us a bigger decrease in oxygen, and it was statistically significant in every single case. And on average, we had a 260% increase in algal biomass from more nitrogen and 110% decrease in oxygen from more nitrogen. So in my mind, this makes what was a hypothesized link even stronger. And so we can say that universally, overloading of nitrogen is really leading to these algal blooms and the low nitrogen, low oxygen conditions. But we know that mitigating nitrogen can work. So just to give an example of this, the first effort towards this was actually in Long Island Sound, third largest estuary in the United States. It had to be a plan managed by the EPA because it's a two-state estuary, Connecticut and New York. And they came up with an ambitious plan. Let's reduce nitrogen by 60%. It was going to cost billions of dollars, but they just moved forward with it. There were skeptics that it would work. But you can see, if you look very carefully at these two maps, on the left are areas of low oxygen in the 90s, and on the right is what happened after there was that 60% reduction in nitrogen. And what you can see are broad regions of Long Island Sound that are no longer what we call dead zones. And if you look carefully below that, you can make it out even finer scale. And if you're into graphs like I am as a scientist, this graph here shows you the trajectory since the plan was began with regards to the amount of nitrogen going into Long Island Sound and the size of what we call the dead zone. And, again, as a scientist, we love statistics. The statistical rigor of this relationship is extremely robust and tells us that there's just no doubt there's a very strong relationship here. And if we know if Long Island Sound can respond, we know other water bodies can as well. And so there are efforts now across Suffolk County. The Suffolk County Subwatersheds Plan lays out a very rigorous, scientifically robust plan to upgrade more than 200,000 septic systems in the coming decades, and really in just the next 30 years. You can see any area that's in the bright pink are the highest priority for upgrades, and this again, robust plan, and these upgrades are specifically meant to protect public water supplies and protect the most sensitive water bodies. And this is going to be done largely by upgrading septic systems. These are the traditional septic systems. The county has approved, as you can see here, 6 other septic systems that can be installed. At the university, I also direct the New York State Center for Clean Water Technology, where we're harnessing science to engineer clean water for the protection of public health and the environment in New York and beyond. And we've developed our own, what we call innovative and alternative septic systems. These are based on very simple principles. In the state of Florida, this will be declared a passive septic system. It runs on one single pump that you can get in Home Depot, and otherwise is comprised of wood chips and sand. And those two components together convert the nitrogen and then remove the nitrogen and convert it to nitrogen gas. And what I'm excited to announce, one, this graph shows the effluent from different systems that have been tested in Suffolk County during the last several years. The red are the ones that we've developed, and we have 3 versions of those, what we call NRBs, nitrogen removing biofilters. The line system, the line version of this, is the top performing system in Suffolk County, and I'm excited to announce that it's been approved for provisional use across Suffolk County, and there's now 3 different groups that can install these. And we have, as I said, 2 other systems, another one that's going to be online we expect next year, and a third, the online system that we're still working on. So this will be part of the solution, where we hopefully can transform our nitrogen levels. So you can see on the upper left is the current nitrogen levels. The more red you see, the higher the nitrogen levels in our groundwater. But in the lower right is if you implement that full plan, where we can get. But the one issue I'll emphasize, of course, is that groundwater flow takes a long time. So the groundwater, for example, that would fall just right here might take a year or two just to get to Shinnecock Bay from here. You wouldn't imagine so, but that's the case. And so what you can see here is that these are travel times. It's hard to see, but anything in red is a 25-year travel time, and anything inside of that is even more than that. Of course, on the outside is slower. Upshot being, even once we upgrade these systems, it will take time for the nitrogen contamination to work its way through the groundwater. So what we need in parallel, what we call in-the-water solutions. Now, I'm not going to talk about all the in-water solutions. Mike Dole is here, Director of Aquaculture and Shellfish Restoration for Stony Brook University. He's led the Shinnecock Bay Restoration Program, where we've planted more than 5 million clams, and in turn, those 5 million adult clams have generated literally tens of millions of clams and increased the abundance of juvenile hard clams, for example, by 250-fold, and increased the harvest of shellfish by more than 20-fold in just a decade. And so shellfish is definitely one of the big approaches for in-the-water solutions, because as we all know, these shellfish can filter the water and keep it clean. But another one that we've been working on, of course, has been seaweeds. And so the question is, how can seaweeds and kelp help? And we know these are photosynthetic organisms, so in happy news, they are taking up CO2. I've already alluded to the fact we live in an era of climate change, and CO2 is the root cause of the climate change, of course, on our planet. And we actually have, in some locations, very high levels of CO2 because of localized nearshore processes beyond what we expect in the atmosphere and the open ocean in the future. So it's a real issue in coastal zones. We also know that these kelp can take up nitrogen, which we want to get out of our water, and they can generate oxygen. And finally, actually, we think can fight harmful algal blooms. I'll talk about that momentarily. Mike has been hard at work, not just on shellfish, but also on kelp. We've grown kelp on 15 locations across New York, from Fisher's Island all the way into the Bronx River estuary, and many locations in between. In most cases, the majority of cases, these are actually on oyster farms. So how much nitrogen can you get out of the water by kelp? Well, we're thinking about what if an oyster farm, a 1-acre oyster farm, had in parallel a 1-acre kelp farm. Well, we think in just a year, that could be 100 to 200 pounds of nitrogen being removed. And that actually is a lot. One of the septic systems I described used about 12 pounds of nitrogen per year. And so that means that this is the equivalent of upgrading 8 to 18 homes. Now, it's not one or the other. It's all of the above, right? So we need to address the septic issue and the fertilizer issue today to have our waters clean for the future, but in parallel, we want to have the kelp to be in the water to protect our waters today as well. Okay, and so I want to sort of end here about how seaweeds can help defend bivalves and bivalve aquaculture against the threats of rising levels of CO2 and harmful algal blooms. And, well, that's an older plot of CO2. I don't know, I'm probably the only person in the room who checks the levels of CO2 on planet Earth on a regular basis. And so we're now I believe we're at 421 and change instead of 420 and change. And that'll keep going up, as you all know. So, again, we think that these seaweeds can fight these harmful algal blooms and fight the rising levels of CO2. We tested this in the field and also in the lab, but here's Mike with some of the kelp that we grew in Moriches Bay, where we did an experiment where we deployed kelp on an oyster farm and then deployed juvenile oysters either within the kelp, next to the kelp, or an area far away from the kelp. And in that particular area, we also monitored the pH. pH, of course, is when you hear the term ocean acidification, that's a sign of high CO2 in a coastal zone, and that's what's happening to our oceans. And so what you can see, the normal pH of the ocean should be about 8. And so on our control site with no kelp, if you follow that line, a lot of wiggle because there's day-night variability with the sun coming up, sun going down, photosynthesis turning on and off. But the bottom line is, if you look at the trends, one, that pH is low in the control site, meaning that we're seeing coastal acidification in this location in Moriches Bay. But two, the kelp is actually, particularly for the first 3 weeks of this experiment, did a significantly, had a significant positive effect on the pH, specifically raising it. And it wasn't just that it made the pH high. You know, if we stopped there, well, maybe nobody would care. But we also did grow those shellfish and saw many-fold increase in the growth rates of the shellfish that were grown right within the kelp, as even higher on the ones next to the kelp compared to the control site. And again, this is evidence that the acidification is slowing the growth of the shellfish, but that you can ameliorate that effect by co-deploying the kelp. With regards to all those harmful algal blooms, again, this is the culprit for those 4 shellfish bed closures that are happening right now across Long Island waters. It makes saxitoxin, which is a neurotoxin, and so that's something we don't want in our waters and something we want to be able to combat. In happy news, we can combat it, and here's how. Here you're looking at what an Alexandrium cell normally looks like on the left. On the right is one exposed to specifically kelp, and I call this Alexandrium spilling its guts, because what it's experiencing is what's known as chlorosis and cell lysis, and so the inside of those cells is spilling out, and the cells are no longer viable. We tested this also in a large volume experiment just across the way in Old Ford Pond, where my student Lane Silvers had 300-gallon tanks filled with Alexandrium, just collected locally, added nutrients that had a mild stimulatory effect, but then also added nutrients and added kelp, and could significantly reduce the amount of Alexandrium in that water. And again, we think this is because it contains bioactive compounds that are active against any plant. We call this allelopathy in science. And it's, you know, plants have been around a lot longer than anything else on this planet, right? And because they can't move, they have to have some sort of secondary metabolite to defend themselves, and we think that's what's happening here. And we've also worked with other seaweeds, right? And I'll emphasize this, kelp is wonderful, but recognize that all the kelp that's in the water right now across all the sites, all those thousands of pounds, will be out of the water in a month. We won't have significant biomass of kelp back in the water. I mean, we'll redeploy in the fall, but it doesn't really hit biomass levels that are significant until March, right? Which means all those positive benefits I just outlined to you are really compacted into the spring. And we're vulnerable then, once again, from June all the way through into the fall. So we've been doing a lot of work on trying to explore what are some other seaweeds that can be deployed during summer months to serve the same role as kelp and all of its benefits, environmental and otherwise, but in those late spring, summer, and fall months. So we've been working with multiple species. One of them is known as Gracilaria. This has been farmed really around the world. And just to show another experiment with that, the brown tide has been the bane of shellfish on Long Island, not with regards to toxins, but actually killing off shellfish. And you can see an experiment here. In just 48 hours, you can see that the densities of brown tide are reduced by more than an order of magnitude in a dose-dependent manner. So again, same idea. There's some sort of secondary compounds that are killing off these brown tide cells. So I call this the halo effect. I think we can all agree we're not going to solve climate change with just some seaweed, right? It needs to be, but it's a tool in the toolbox. And in my view, it can have a very strong localized effect, particularly when it comes to aquaculture. And I call this the halo effect. And so that is the idea. If you can co-cultivate seaweeds, kelp in the spring, but we need to fill in the blank for the summer and fall, you can protect those shellfish against harmful algal blooms and against ocean acidification. So the final thing I want to talk about is, what about the cleanliness of seafood and sea products in our coastal waters, right? I'm showing you an image here of septic system draining into our surface waters, and in some ways that's how it's going. So should we be worried? And so I just want to address that in just a few points. I want to start on the nitrogen front. So in wastewater that comes out, the nitrogen is what, I'm not going to give a chemistry lesson, but just say it's called organic nitrogen, right? We can imagine that it's coming from, well, our bodies. But once it's in the water, the very first thing that happens, in a very rapid fashion, is it goes through a process called ammonification. And so, I mean, here's the chemical reaction, but the bottom line is here, in very short order, that nitrogen that was in wastewater is just a free-floating tiny molecule. It's a nitrogen bound to 3 hydrogens. It's no different than any other nitrogen that you would get from any other source on any other place in the planet, right? That could even be converted to nitrate. And what's nitrate? Well, it's nitrogen with 3 oxygens, right? But once it goes through this process, it's no different than the nitrogen that you and I are all breathing right now. Well, I guess it's a little bit different because that's nitrogen gas. Remember, 80% of our atmosphere is nitrogen gas. And this nitrogen, whether it's an ammonium atom that's, just right outside of a very polluted area, or an ammonium atom that you find right in the middle of the most pristine waters of the Sargasso Sea, it's the same molecule. It's chemically indistinguishable, and there's nothing else associated with it. And when it comes to microbial contaminants, again, the idea of drinking septic water probably obviously is enough to make anyone sick. But a very important concept when it comes to the microbes in wastewater, of course, and we know, right, what's wastewater filled with? Bacteria and viruses. But there's a reason that the health code allows for you to have a well for drinking water just 200 feet from a septic tank, right? And again, probably not ideal, but the reason is that the aquifer below our feet does a terrible job of removing nitrogen, but does an amazing job of retaining microbes. The reason this law is in effect, and it's expanded over time, it used to be 100 feet, it's now 200 feet, and it keeps up with the science, bacteria cannot migrate more than a few hundred feet within the aquifer. They're all retained. Now, there could be other things that make its way through, but the microbes are not going to be an issue. And that goes whether the water is moving vertically or horizontally. And just to show some examples of this, in my lab, we've done some work called microbial source tracking, trying to understand if you see bacteria in the water, where are they coming from? And I could give a lot of slides in this, and it's a DNA-based fingerprinting approach. I'm not going to go through the methods, and we'll give many examples. But just here's a quick one, studying Accabonac Harbor. Where are the bacteria coming from? And specifically here, and these are specifically fecal bacteria. Where are they coming from, right? And here's the answer, right? You can see the human percentage in this graph varies somewhere between less than 1%, and in one particular case that's right by a marina, and this is a trend we do tend to see by boats, right? There may be boat discharge. In that case, it's 5%, maybe I think around somewhere in the vicinity of 5%. And just one more example here. Here's Georgica Pond. Now, here's a place where I did a study, and the question was, where's the nitrogen come from? And the nitrogen is coming from septic systems. But then and the hypothesis would be, it must be loaded with bacteria. But actually, the answer is those bacteria, the human-derived bacteria, which are the ones in the red here, are the smallest fraction, right? You can detect it at a very, very low level. And the reason being, it's all getting retained in the sandy aquifer. Right? And so, the DEC has mapped out all of New York waters, whether they're open or closed to shellfishing. In some cases, they can be seasonally open or seasonally closed. But there's guidance all across the area. So here's just an example, a place in Moriches Bay. And you can see certain areas, you cannot harvest shellfish. And other areas, just in season. And other areas, always open for shellfishing. Right? And this is based on the collection of literally hundreds of thousands of data points looking at the levels of bacteria. We've also looked at specifically some of the contaminants associated with kelp. Right? So here's some of our team out in the Moriches Bay site. They can stand in the water, and that's a really fun-looking photo. And here's some data, right, where we use the prescribed protocol to look for fecal coliform bacteria on the kelp. And so what you can see here are a lot of zeros. There's one number that's 1, and that was in one replicate, and the other replicate was a 0. So, maybe positive, maybe not. But fecal coliform is not nearly as specific as E. coli, and we could not find a single colony-forming unit of E. coli on any of the kelp grown. This is for the Peconic estuary, but we found the same thing for Moriches Bay. We've also looked at other sort of contaminants. You can see all the different ones we tested for here, all undetectable in the kelp. And then multiple trace metals, completely undetectable. Some metals at a high level, as would be expected. What's the most abundant things in salt water? Well, it's sodium, potassium, magnesium. And so, some elevated levels there. The seafood is salty. And arsenic levels are actually somewhat elevated. But in happy news, this is what we call organic arsenic, completely unbioavailable to humans in happy news. So I'm done. And so my conclusions, excessive nitrogen loading is an ongoing threat to coastal ecosystems, human health, and economies. I didn't talk much about it, but climate change is having a compounding effect. We know upgrading septic systems is a great way to address this problem, and we know that seaweeds and shellfish hold the promise to mitigate a lot of these problems. So I thank you for your attention, and I'm excited about the rest of the day.
So thank you, Chris. That was wonderful, really insightful. And I just wanted to do 2 pieces of housekeeping. I forgot to mention that we are accepting questions for our speakers today. And if you received a brochure, there should be a little QR code on it. If not, I think we have a slide here that has the QR code. Not sure if that's going to come up. But also on your brochure, it's on the website. So if you have a question, it'll take you to a Google form, and you can submit it to any of the speakers or a particular one. So it's this QR code that's up there, so you could use your phone, be a little tech savvy, and that will lead you to the Google form. I also want to say that we are streaming this live, and we are recording it. Thank you to Frank for doing that. And so welcome to the crowds out there listening to our summit. So our next speaker is Michael Ciaramella, and he works with New York Sea Grant's Seafood Technology Department. He's a specialist. He works with the seafood industry, regulatory agencies, and food and nutrition professionals on issues related to seafood safety, quality, and marketing. Efforts include the management of the National Seafood HACCP, I can't say that word, Alliance's Internet Training Course, and conducting seafood training courses in New York and around the U.S. So kelp is not seafood or a sea animal, but it's, there are certainly some parallels that Mike will discuss, so thank you.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Judy Ann, and thank you for the invitation to speak here today. As you said, my name is Mike Ciaramella. I'm the Seafood Safety and Technology Specialist with New York Sea Grant, but the last couple of years I have been diving very deeply into the wonderful world of seaweeds, and specifically bringing seaweed to market safely as a food, because there's a lot of interest in growing this industry across the country, not just here in New York. So today, thank you, Dr. Gobler, for going into some of the science and sharing some of that, but I'm going to speak more generally about food safety, and then go specifically into some of the food safety hazards and concerns with kelp and how you can potentially mitigate and control them to ensure that we can bring these products to market as safe for consumption, right? So overview of what I want to cover here today, and again, this is going to be a very brief introduction to many of these topics, which can be fairly complex, but I want to start with a general introduction to food safety, then go into regulations and how we regulate and ensure food safety to protect public health through the agencies and the various players involved, seaweed hazards more specifically, as well as controls for potential hazards associated with seaweeds and seaweed products, and then ultimately go into cover briefly some of the current and ongoing efforts that are happening right now to address this exact question, right, before a quick summary. So when we talk about food safety hazards, and again, these are general food safety hazards. I'm not talking about kelp alone here. I'm talking about food. Anything you eat, consume, put in your mouth, there are hazards associated with that, right? Those hazards fit within 3 main categories. They can be biological hazards, which would be our bacteria, our parasites, our viruses. They can be chemical hazards, which would be naturally occurring environmental chemical contaminants, right? So some species have contaminants or toxins that are inherently associated with them, pufferfish, right? Harmful algal blooms, right? Introducing natural toxins into our waterways. Right? There are also some industrial pollutants that can make their way into the environment as a whole, especially into our waterways and our coastal areas. Right? There are also physical hazards. So these would be things like glass, plastic, metal. Those are more associated with the process, not necessarily the environment and the source where you're coming from. So our focus here is really going to be those biological and chemical hazards that could be associated with the environment, but also sometimes introduced during the processing. Now I want to touch on food safety regulation, again, more broadly and generally with regards to how we regulate foods in general within the US. Our food safety systems are based on preventive controls, right, and ensuring that we're preventing hazards from entering our food supply and resulting in foodborne illness. And we really have a kind of a tiered or staggered system. We call it a pyramid when we're kind of looking at it more broadly and generally. At the base of that pyramid, we have our GMPs, or our good manufacturing practices. These are basically the general guidelines for how you maintain facilities that are meant for producing foods, right? What types of materials can and can't be used, how those facilities are maintained, what type of equipment is food grade and adequate and for use as a food production equipment. The next level or layer of that pyramid is going to be your sanitation control procedures or sanitation control program. And that consists of a variety of what we call SSOPs, or sanitation standard operating procedures. That's basically how you maintain that equipment, that facility in a sanitary way, sanitary manner, right? Making sure you're removing any potential contaminants, whether they're microbial or chemical, to prevent them from making their way into food products, right? At the top of that system is what we call our food safety plan, right? And there are many terms that we use for these food safety plans, and it really depends on the food commodity that you're dealing with. But the main ones are going to be your HACCP plan, which stands for Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Points. Seafood relies and is regulated under a HACCP system, right? There are also preventive control food safety plans that are very, very similar in that these food safety plans require producers to identify any potential hazards associated with their products, determine which of those are significant for their particular product and how they are processing it, and then implement controls to prevent those hazards from making their way to the consumer. Right? So now I want to talk and touch a little bit more specifically on seaweeds, right? Because in order for you to develop effective food safety plans and control potential hazards, you need to understand what are those potential hazards. So there's been a lot of work done on this already. The Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, which is a division of the Food and Drug Administration that regulates foods in the US, has done an assessment or analysis of the literature and the occurrences of foodborne illness to identify what are the hazards associated with seaweeds and seaweed products. They've identified 4 major hazards associated with seaweeds and seaweed products and 4 moderate hazards associated with those products in both the biological and chemical hazard categories. With regards to its major hazards, biological hazard would be Salmonella, right, a bacterial pathogen. Moderate hazard would be norovirus, right, which is a virus that's common sometimes in some foods. Chemical hazards would be arsenic, cadmium, and iodine would be the major hazards or the more concerning hazards. Lead, mercury, aluminum being those moderate food safety hazards. Now, this doesn't mean that all seaweed has all of these contaminants in it. This means that these are potential contaminants that have been isolated and found in these products, right, and have caused issues with regard to public health in the past. Right? The United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, as well as the World Health Organization, did something similar on a global scale, because seaweed is not new, right? Seaweed has been consumed for centuries all around the world. It is a major component of the diet of many other cultures outside of the United States, right? On that scale, the UN and the WHO identified these same hazards with the exception of Bacillus cereus, one other bacteria that they identified and categorized as a moderate hazard. So basically what I'm just trying to emphasize here is that we have an understanding of what those potential hazards of concern might be, which is the foundation for developing a food safety plan to protect public health in the end. Now, in addition to knowing what those hazards are, these producers are required to put in place controls to prevent these hazards from making it to market, right, to protect public health. With regards to biological hazards, right, one of the main controls is going to be sourcing, right, and Dr. Gobler touched on that. We already monitor microbial pathogens within our waterways, or microbial concentrations within our waterways, to designate certified and uncertified waters for shellfish production. So we know which waters across Long Island and across the country where we can grow foods, right, because there are low microbial loads. There are also techniques that we can use and employ post-harvest to additionally reduce the level of microbial pathogens or hazards, including water and steam blanching, as well as chemical sanitation. Now, these aren't unique to kelp. These are things that are used in food production in general. Lots of produce they use chemical sanitation methods and chemical dips in chlorine or peracetic acid, right, to remove pathogen loads on a variety of different products that come to market in the US. right? And the steaming and the blanching is another way we can do that and control those microbial hazards post-harvest. When it comes to chemical hazards, the big control or the main control there is really going to be sourcing, right? Because these chemical hazards are basically being taken up into these products through the environment, right? And so you need to make sure that you're taking them from an environment that doesn't have high levels of these contaminants. And the best way we can assess that and ensure that is through product testing. Right? Connecticut has a seaweed industry that's growing and producing food, right? And they require all seaweed that's harvested from Connecticut waters to be tested for the various contaminants of concern, and they cannot make it to the food market without knowing and first seeing that there's no potential hazards to public health there and associated with that. And that's something that can be easily implemented into the New York industry to ensure that we can bring products to market safe. It'll also give us baseline data to assess what water bodies are suitable for food production and what water bodies might be more suitable for other aspects. There are other outlets for use of kelp, whether it be fertilizer or bioplastics or a variety of other uses that are being explored. There are also potentially some process mitigation strategies, so some ways you can process the kelp to remove some potential contaminants that can be explored as well. The last thing I wanted to touch on here is you'll hear bioremediation, and you'll see that that's becoming a hot topic. People are using more than just kelp and seaweeds, but they're using shellfish as well to perform bioremediation, which is essentially removal of toxic compounds, right, from the environment, right? In the case of our seaweeds and our shellfish, it's from our marine and aquatic environments, right? But when you're using those organisms for bioremediation and removal of toxic compounds, that is not a food, right? You're not producing a food product. That is strictly for bioremediation, and you need to find alternative sources and uses for products that are used for that. So now I want to touch quickly on the various and ongoing efforts that have been done and are going to be continued. I have initiated a New York Seaweed Processing and Marketing Task Force about 2 years ago because I started to get a lot of questions on, can we bring seaweed to market as a food? How do we do it? How is it regulated? At the time, I didn't have those answers. My focus has always been seafood, right? And we don't have a large seaweed industry in the United States as a whole. There are some states that have a longer history of it, but for the most part, we don't produce a lot of seaweed domestically. Right? So starting to ask those questions, we developed this task force to start to address them. There's also a national Sea Grant Seaweed Hub that's a more national effort looking at collaborating and bringing together the variety of resources that exist, and I'll touch on that. And then lastly, not too long ago, coordinated and started to initiate conversations around the development of a seaweed food safety training program, which I'll also touch on. When it comes to our New York task force, right, in trying to address those questions of how do we bring seaweed to market food safely as a food, we worked with our regulatory agencies, we worked with the industry, NGOs, and academics and researchers across the state, as well as some of our partnering states nearby, to come up with a guidance document. So we have this regulatory guide that was developed that outlines how seaweed is regulated in New York, right, and how you can bring it to market as a food under existing food safety regulations, as well as some supplemental resources that go into a little bit more detail on some of the regulations and requirements, as well as best practices for handling those products to ensure safety and quality. We'll continue to meet and explore new opportunities for development of resources to support the industry as they move forward. I do have some hard copies of these with me. If anybody is interested, please come see me. They're also available free on the New York Sea Grant website. As far as the National Seaweed Hub, right, the Seaweed Hub is a collaborative across many New York Sea Grant programs, as well as many other organizations across the country. They come together and they have work groups that look at various functional areas, including regulations, post-harvest and processing, production systems, and market opportunities, right, and have developed a series of resources to, again, support the emerging industries across the country. They have the State of the States resource, which is a status of the industry report, giving a sense of what is happening with regards to seaweed production across the nation and what are those products that are being produced being used for. They've developed a national nursery directory to help farmers engage and identify sources of seed. And they're working on testing standards, so the potential hazards that could be associated with seaweeds and what are the standards and threshold levels related to those for food consumption. There's also some work in the food safety and the regulation space, which is kind of part of this seaweed food safety training work group that I've also been heavily involved in. And so this work group came together to figure out how we best train our industry on seafood or seaweed safety, right? Because as I said, I'm the seafood specialist and I teach seafood HACCP, right? The Hazard Analysis Critical Control Points. Seaweed is not actually regulated under the HACCP model and HACCP system. It falls under the Preventive Controls for Human Foods rule, which is slightly different but a very similar preventive food safety program. And so we needed to get additional clarity on how this was actually regulated and how we can adequately train the industry on producing these food safety plans to prevent potential hazards from making it to market. So we had 3 priorities we've identified. The first was that clarity on the regulatory structure. The second was providing additional guidance more specific to seaweed on the food safety hazards and how you can control them. And lastly, that would serve as that foundation for a food safety training program to support an emerging industry to bring foods to market safely. And so, in summary, there are hazards associated with all foods, right? And the food safety systems are designed and in place to help prevent those hazards from making it to market and making consumers sick. Testing protocols are being optimized and developed and defined for the variety of chemical contaminants that could potentially be a concern in seaweed products. And there's a lot of guidance now being created around the best practices to ensure safety as well as quality of these types of products to bring them to market. But the take home that I really want to leave with you all with is that hazards, they exist amongst all foods. Every food that you put in your mouth, there's a hazard associated with that. Some are more higher risk than others, but it's about controlling those hazards and mitigating those hazards, both at the processor level, but also you as the consumer play a role in that and understanding food safety, how you properly handle these products when you bring them home, how you store them, how you prepare them. And I'll end with that. My contact information is up here. I will stick around. I'll be here later if there are any other questions. But please feel free to reach out if you want to learn more about seafood or seaweed food safety.
Thank you, Michael. That was really illuminating. So between the 2 talks so far, I have to say I first thought that a kelp here was only useful for fertilizer, and so I guess the food question was up in the air, and I think there's a lot more clarity now, so thank you so much. I appreciate that. I also wanted to say that we're about to watch a film, but there are some posters that are out in the lobby, so afterwards I would love for you to take a look. I believe they're from the grad students, is that correct? The grad students of the Marine Science program have put the posters up there on the wall, so please do take some time to take a look at those. Yeah. Again, if you have questions, use the barcode, please send them in, and we'll address them at the end of our sessions. So without further delay, right, I think we have a film to watch.
My favorite part about gardening is the interaction and connection you have with the earth. But you can really see and feel the living part of the plant. They're not just something green that just grows out the ground, out the dirt. They really are a living being.
What do I love about gardening? I just couldn't even imagine life without it. Everything I do, I know because I'm doing it without harsh chemicals, without toxics, and in tune with the place. Everything I know, I'm doing something good. Sometimes you could eat it, or other times you just watch the amazing display of butterflies, and this whole place is just always buzzing and flapping.
Quaid na Tampeog, Bijiki na Baut na Dasvis Bijiki and Dodem, Shinnecock na Wachie Medewa and Matawak Ninu. Hello, my friends and family. My name is Standing Buffalo. I'm of the Buffalo clan, and I'm a Medewa and Matawak man from Shinnecock. My given name is Shane Weeks, but Bijiki Niboit is who I am. And we are here on the Shinnecock Reservation at a garden that I care for at my parents' house where I grew up.
Our area has quadrupled in population. Knowing the state of Shinnecock Bay and Hetty Creek, which is what surrounds us here at the head, it's paralyzing knowing how bad things are. There's very little natural lawn care right now, very little things that are just left to be natural. And a lot of fertilizer is finding its ways into our seas and our water and our food.
There's endless opportunity for kelp because it's completely no impact. And how could that be bad as opposed to other methods of creating fertilizer, even the good ones? I think this is the best one. This bed just got a giant dose recently of kelp and planted with my fall crop of mustard greens. And they germinated in like 2 days. I don't know whether it was the kelp, but they germinated so fast. We put kelp in here and it's exploding. 2 weeks ago, this plant was just reaching the top. And every day it grows a couple feet. Pretty much everything here got a dose of kelp this year.
We've been growing this garden as a whole. We've been trying to spread into other spaces within it. We've been doing a lot of cover cropping, moving into new areas, so we're trying to just grow more and more for them and do as much of their production as we can.
We used it in the melon patch and it looks like it's sort of doing a good job, a really healthy melon. And you know, just generally, I think we're excited to sort of explore some more opportunities, both in the farm and on the table.
This is a brand new bed, and we loaded it with kelp. It's coming along, because these were tiny plants. Most of them were just stuff we plucked from our other beds, things that we knew the deer wouldn't eat. And it's starting to happen.
Using kelp specifically is new to this part of the area, right? But traditionally, we've used seaweed in our gardens. These are the first Shinnecock and Montauk beans that have been grown on Shinnecock land in near 100 years. I first built a smaller version of this in 2017, and it was maybe a third of the size. And then this year I decided to expand it. This is the most substantial garden that I've been able to caretake for. I had no idea that this kind of corn got this tall. I think that says quite a bit. You know?
Everybody gets taught like these basic things to do so that you could sustain yourself if you need to, and how to use what's around. It would be a failure not to teach your children that. It would be a failure as an individual and as a community, because we would lose our gifts.
Which is the first time that Indian tribes in this country were allowed to go to federal court. And so we filed a case for the Shinnecock Hills, and the court refused to hear it. This was in 1970s. So starting in the 1970s, we saw a massive overdevelopment of this entire region. All of these homes that you see around this campus were not here. And that's when we started to see massive die-offs of the food source that we had relied on here. Since the last ice age, almost 13,000 years ago, we were able to sustain ourselves on the abundance of the shellfish and the seaweed that was here in both Shinnecock Bay and the Peconic Bay. Now we see our waters designated as federal fishery disaster zones because over 99% of the sea scallops died. We see massive fish die-offs. We see these imbalances in oxygen and the brown tides and the red tides and the devastation to our shellfish industry. And it can be directly linked to this population boom that started in the 1970s without any wastewater treatment systems. Most municipalities have sewers, they treat their wastewater. It doesn't happen here. And so all of these nitrates that are causing these mortality events in the water, again, they devastate our tradition, our culture, our legacy, And I'm not a scientist, I'm an attorney. And so how this issue came to me was I spend a lot of time with culture bearers and elders and spiritual people of my nation. And one of the tradition carriers are the wampum carvers. And wampum is this beautiful purple and white shell that is carved into jewelry and beads and has been exchanged as a means of storytelling since colonial times. It was the first currency traded on Wall Street, and it's really only produced here from the clamshells that come from Shinnecock. Right across the way in Parish Pond, we had a wampum mint, and so this industry for us is not a new industry. I know, like, I'm really glad to see the posters in the lobby. It's like, but we're beyond sugar kelp here. We're looking at all kinds of seaweeds. Ulva here has been a natural resource that is so important. I see on the posters, I'm so glad to see that's traditionally what we would use to fertilize our soil. We would also use it for home insulation. We would use it for cosmetics, for medicinal purposes. There's so many different beneficial uses that, again, the Shinnecock Nation has been using for thousands of years. So I'm really excited just to see like the movement go beyond sugar kelp for this region, because I think ulva, and when you look at, like, I thought that was a great presentation. When you look at co-culturing, it's really the way to put the seaweed together with the shellfish. That's definitely the solution for our region. I would like to see more utilization of ulva for sure, especially as the agriculture use in this region changes and shifts towards growing like regenerative and crops that are in constant need of replenishment, like cannabis. Ulva has been found to be an incredible biostimulant, increase yield and production. I mean, you could also use it on your yard and in your garden. And that's how Shinnecock has used it. When the first European colonists got here in 1640, they were really cold and really hungry, and we showed them how to use the seaweed to insulate their homes. And that's why a lot of times when you see homes now being demolished to build a new mansion, they were built in the 1700s, people are shocked to see seaweed in the walls. But also as a way to fertilize. We used it to fertilize corn, bean, and squash, the three sisters. Which was the predominant agricultural method here. Using the ulva sea lettuce, we were able to sustain a very large population because it does have such an incredible biostimulant ability. You gotta really add it with like fish, but a mixture of ulva and fish is really incredible for the agricultural system. And it's really significant to me as an attorney because seaweed was the way that my tribe gained our federal recognition, because we have recorded rights to the abundant natural resource that is seaweed, reserved for us going back to the 1600s, and as well as court cases showing that the nation is the entity that's allowed to lease out seaweed lots in the bays here in Southampton. And so those are really critical things that the United States looked at when we were going under this federal review to show that we exerted our jurisdiction over the bay bottoms here. But we're just a really huge resource of traditional ecological knowledge, and I think a lot of power and solutions come when we can combine that traditional ecological knowledge with modern innovation in science and technology. And it's a really good partnership that Shinnecock Kelp Farmers has had with Stony Brook University and Montauk Seaweed Company and a lot of the other folks that are here today. So thank you so much for everyone attending, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. I really do think it's important that we do combine traditional ecological knowledge with science and practice. So I hope that you'll come and spend some more time with us here, and that we could do workshops and learn more. So our next person up is Trevor Swope from the Montauk Seaweed Supply Company, and I'm going to read you his bio. Oh, there you go, that's okay, it was like a quick entrance. Trevor is an original co-founder of Dr. Dish, the community-supported fishery program of New York, the first of its kind, I do believe. He also is a trained chef who works in Montauk and began interning on kelp farms in Connecticut almost a decade ago, where he learned about the many uses of locally farmed kelp. So without further ado, Trevor.
All right, thank you so much, and thank you all for being here. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. Happy Earth Day Eve to everyone. Not to be redundant, but I do just want to take a moment to thank and honor and acknowledge the local Indigenous community. Thank Tila for your attendance, for having us here, as well as the rest of the members of the Shinnecock Nation. Thank you so much. Let's see, a little bit about me. How's this work? Thank you. There we go. All right, very briefly, just a little bit about myself. Actually, my bio is pretty much done at this point, but I've spent most of my career trying to find more sustainable solutions for how we engage with the planet. And coincidentally, not so coincidentally, that always brings me back to Indigenous methods. The path that brought me to co-founding a seaweed fertilizer company is a little atypical. As you heard, I am a chef by trade. I got to do some really wonderful work with Dr. Dish, the community-supported fishery, and got my first exposure to kelp farming just about a decade ago. And this project I'm particularly excited about because it really satisfies what I love to do most, which is work with groups of passionate people to try to find better ways to engage with the planet. And this project addresses a multitude of those simultaneously, namely climate change and restoring the health of our seas and our soils. So the best way for me to explain exactly how we sort of are going about that mission is to show you a brief video actually made by local documentary filmmaker Dama Breel, who I think is in the audience. But here we go, hopefully. All right. And then can you do the play? Sweet.
My name is Matt Welling. I own Lucky 13 Oyster Farm, and we've been experimenting with kelp for the last 3 years. The kelp has a whole set of things that feel good, you know, the nitrogen mitigation and the carbon sequestration, and so we just think it's a no-brainer to try to see if we can make a business out of growing kelp.
My name is Ryan Andos. I am co-owner of Route 27 Hemp Yard and Route 27 Hop Yard. Once kelp's taken out of the water, we bring it over to our drying facility. It dries down anywhere between 7 to 10% moisture content. Comes out of there, goes through our hammer mill, gets milled down, and after it gets milled down, gets bagged, and Sean comes and picks it up. Kelp would be awesome to clean up our bays and our harbors from that nitrogen pollution and those nitrates, and also the end product then can be used in agriculture.
My name is Patty Gentry, and I own and operate Early Girl Farm in Brookhaven on Long Island. I just feel that there's an incredible untapped potential with kelp. The interesting thing about using ocean products is that, number one, per square foot of ocean, there's more minerals than you'll ever find in a square foot of soil. And then we return it to the soil where it feeds the plants that feed us. It's like a win-win situation.
Montauk seaweed is awesome, turning the kelp into fertilizer, closing that nitrogen loop, not introducing new nitrogen into the system by putting the kelp on as fertilizer. It's just an incredible idea.
Here on Long Island, we're surrounded by ocean. How exciting is it to begin to learn how we can just use what we're surrounded by to feed the soil and feed ourselves and build a healthier environment for us all.
All right. Thank you to the AV team for making that happen. As you can see from what you just watched, we are working to start a sea-to-soil movement by transforming locally grown kelp into healthy fertilizers that can be used on your lawn, garden, farm, vineyard, any of the above. Secondly, Montauk Seaweed Supply Company, we are New York State's first processing and production operation for farmed kelp, raw kelp grown on the East Coast. We're currently the only operation in New York State to manufacture biostimulant and fertilizer products using macroalgae materials sourced from the sea. I also just want to emphasize that all of that work is really done with a big emphasis on safety first. We are licensed by the New York State Department of Agriculture. All of our products are tested and analyzed rigorously by the leading laboratory in the state, and all of our products are OMRI certified for use in organic agriculture. Finally pictured here is Regency, and this is the world's first kelp meal product that features exclusively sugar kelp. We're excited to share that a recent study from our friends at the Cornell Cooperative has shown that sugar kelp performs equally to any other sort of imported or unsustainable rockweed or anything like that. I would like to encourage all of you to get some Regency for yourself. Please visit our general manager, Abby Blessington, at the info desk up there. She's got samples. Take it home, try it out for yourselves. We just ask that you tag us on your socials if you do, Montauk Seaweed, at Montauk Seaweed. And I wanted to keep this short and sweet. There's a lot of great speakers following me. So for more information, visit us online, montaukseaweed.com. And again, I just want to express my gratitude to all of you for being here, to Tila and the Shinnecock Nation again for being here, for showing us the path forward, and for all of your inspiration. So thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Trevor, and thank you, Montauk Seaweed Supply Company, for giving us all some samples that we could try at home. So that's fabulous. Thank you. Our next speaker is Edwina Van Gaal, and I didn't actually even prepare something to introduce you, because Edwina is just, if anyone who knows Edwina, she's done such amazing things for our community, for our nation, and for the birds, for the flora, for the fauna, for the insects, and she inherently embraces the traditional ecological knowledge by making us look at the environment as a whole, as opposed to individual aspects of it. So I will let Edwina come and work her magic. Thank you.
So yes, I'm from the Perfect Earth Project, and we promote nature-based land care. And I'm the only one probably here who's not actually part of the seafood and the seaweed industry. How many of you are professionals in the landscape world? Oh, I know you. If you live long enough, we know everybody. And so, anyway, so what I would like to talk to you about is why it's so important. Why is it so important for the land that this product comes from the sea and goes back on the land? Because this is my inspiration, and my dog. But this is what feeds me, because it's the best landscape, the one you don't have to do anything, because I'm not allowed to touch it. But this is what's happening because of the way we are treating our land, and because we're using imported inputs and to produce unnatural levels of growth. We're putting unnatural levels of stress on our plants, and then we're expecting them to perform in ways that nature never intended. So, and this is our land. You know, this land Long Island's very young. You know, this South Fork's only 60,000 years old. There were humans on the earth when the glacier came down and formed the South Fork. The North Fork was 20,000 years later. And so we have a very small amount of topsoil and a large, except in the Bridgehampton loam areas, it varies with how this terminal rain hit the ground. Imagine a mile or two of ice above us right now. And that's what it was. And so, and that's what gave us this amazing ecosystems and this incredible wealth that is in our hands, and we're not altogether managing it all that well, so we're causing collapses of insect and bird populations. People notice that more than plants. I notice plants, but I generally use mammals and insects as my indicator species because people respond more viscerally to them. We've lost the birds because of loss of habitat and use of pesticides. Those are the primary drivers. And as you know, this is what's happening. And even when this house was built, habitat was taken away, and we're not putting it back. And so how can we do that but to respect all the life forms, not just our own? So that is what Perfect Earth is working on, and what Kelp does is returns a kind of living force to the land. One of the things that I don't particularly focus on, even though in the film I was in my vegetable garden primarily, I'm urging people to think about the other life forms and providing food for them. Our industries, our landscape industry is really based on an agricultural model. It treats land as if it is a product and that it needs to be extracted from, so that's because that's the agricultural model. You take something, you consume it, and then you toss it. And landscapes should just be basically for joy and for giving back. And we're not pulling anything out, so we shouldn't really have to put anything back in. So in a way, I never approve of products, but I'm okay with the kelp because it's not really imported. It's right out there. It's a cycle. We look at landscapes as a way, how can you close the loop on a piece of land? And that means everything that land produces stays on that land. It does not go to the landfill. It is not garbage. It is the food that piece of land made for itself. So how can you walk out your door or walk anywhere and say, I will do this place no harm? Because every life form on that place is important to that place. So this is harmful, we know. So leaving the leaves is really important, and everybody's heard about that, but there's an incredible amount of life that lives in those leaves. So when you harm them, you're harming all the pollinators and all of the biology, really, of that place. And so, but the other thing is that people are constantly chopping their plants back and sending that to the dump. So generally when you bring in a pruning crew, they're probably removing a great deal more leaf surface than something like this. But when people see this and this plant, this animal is not even cutting into the wood, but people think, oh my God. And so they call in this after they've just thrown a third of that plant's leaf surface away, but one caterpillar and got to go, and then there's nothing for this because birds have to feed caterpillars. About 90% of our songbirds feed caterpillars to their young, because think of it, a baby bird can't really swallow like seeds and pits at their age. And caterpillars contain a lot of proteins and keratin, which helps them build their feathers. And so if you don't know what it is, don't kill it. Do you know what this is? Anybody know what this is? This is the larval form of that, of a ladybug. So you would probably think when you saw that previous bug that you ought to kill it. But actually, it's doing an incredible job for you. So we say, if you don't know its name, wait, get to know it before you kill it. So are our lives surrounded by habitat? Can you create as much habitat as possible in the place that you live? You weren't going to eat those leaves anyway, so why not share them with nature? And so if your land has been degraded really badly, kelp is kind of the only thing I could ever recommend that you could sort of bring from the outside. And they've even improved the packaging, because now it's paper. Started out plastic, and now it's paper. And it's not coming from very far. The impact is so minimal, because we say, keep your biomass on your property. Biomass is every bit of organic matter that a property produces. Every year I cut my meadow to keep it from succeeding. What do? Well, I decided, why am I dragging this stuff around and composting it and everything? Why not just build haystacks? And is an homage à Monet. And so now I have haystacks, but this was soil that I excavated to make my pond, and we turned it into a very strange termite hill. But this year we dug actually a hibernaculum into the base. Does anybody know what a hibernaculum is? It is an overwintering place for snakes. I heard somebody say snakes, yeah. So the guys the guys who landscape for me, they kill every snake they ever saw. So we've really got a whole new snake appreciation program going. And I highly recommend hibernaculi. I will have to get a picture of mine. And can you do it without machinery, if possible? I call it the world of noise and poison. And the sound of a scythe is incredibly peaceful. Can't say it's easy to find somebody who will do it, but it's really nice. And so how can we change the aesthetic? Because it's just like, how can we change the product? How can we change this entire process, the way we treat our land, and turn it into one that's respect and cohabitation? And we have a totally unusual idea now of what a good landscape is, and I'm trying to change that. This is Brooklyn Bridge Park. You can see Brooklyn Bridge in the background. This is an area that heretofore people would have thought was the part they didn't do yet. And actually it's the part that they did do, and it's filled with pollinators, and now the public is beginning to really appreciate it. And this is my own garden, and it's like out of control, and I like it that way. And so does nature. And so we started something called 2/3 for the Birds. We really encourage everybody to sign up. It's 234birds.org, or go to our website. It's a self-regulating community of people who have simply all agreed, I'm going to do this. 2 out of every plants in my property, I will buy native. I will not use pesticides. And I will, little by little, get rid of invasives if I can. I'll know what they are, and I'll try to replace them with something that isn't. This way, other people, if you sign the list, you can find other professionals. And it's self-regulating, because who would put their name on the list and then not do it? And you'll know they're not doing it because you're talking to them and you're all sharing. And so this is us, another QR code. You can find us on there. We created a leaflet that goes into the practices of how to do nature-based landscaping. It's in English and Spanish. We do very occasional newsletters, because I have other things to do, so we would never flood your inbox. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Edwina. And I guess a good takeaway from that is that we can each do something significant. So individual actions can make a big difference. And I know we do have some organizations here that certainly promote that and things that you can do. And I'm thinking drawdown. But let's take some questions. I know we have closing remarks by Fred Thiel. I don't think he's here yet. And I'm really happy to say that we're ahead of schedule, which is really rare and I think much better. So we have someone coming up with the questions, and our speakers, it might be directed to all of you, or So this is a question from Barney, and anyone is free to answer, any of our speakers. Oh, you are, hello.
Tell you that question's been answered by everyone's discussion already.
All right, well.
That was my ignorant question before I got here and learned anything.
So you learned something, so that's really admirable, that's great. Okay, this is from Marissa for Dr. Gobler. Okay, so curious to know why kelps are pulled out during the summer and fall months. Why are they only available and beneficial during spring months? So you want to come up and answer that? And then you could probably stay up here.
That's a real simple answer, and that is that it's a cold water species. So if you left it in the water, it would just die off in the month of June. In fact, come fall, the only place to find kelp is in the deepest, coldest waters. And frankly, just to be perfectly honest, kelp is on the run from our waters because of climate change. So another reason to be looking at other seaweeds is that the growing season for kelp is going to continue to shrink. We had a situation just a few years ago where, just to step back real quick, the process by which we grow kelp is we collect reproductive tissues in the fall. And then that's when the reproductive tissues are present. You can then spawn the kelp onto the line then gets put out and grown, and then it's harvested in the spring. But what's happening is that because our water, I mentioned already, we've seen a statistically significant and rapid increase in summer temperatures in our coastal waters, but also in the fall, and that just makes sense, right? If the water's super warm in the summer, it takes time to cool down. And again, we're seeing asynchronous warming of our waters. It's not necessarily that much warmer in the spring and winter, but more so in the spring, summer and fall. Anyway, point being, just a few years ago, we went out and expecting to find cold water and reproductive kelp. It was late October, and I think it was something like 65 degrees deep in Long Island Sound. And so we expect the kelp season to continue to shrink with time. And again, that's because, so the direct answer to the question, it's a cold water species that dies in summer. And so that's why it's so imperative that we move on to other summer seaweeds. I was so happy to hear Tila, wherever she is, she's still here, mention ulva, because it's so important that we look towards the suitability of these summer seaweeds to serve the same ecological and potentially agricultural and food roles. So.
All right, well, next one is for you as well. Oh. So, what scale of kelp growth is needed to make an impact on reducing nitrogen levels in the water around Long Island? Is kelp shown to increase oxygen levels in water? And what are the challenges at scaling this technology? This is a question by Max.
Yeah. So thank you for the question. And so it definitely improves oxygen. And the very simple answer is more, right? The more kelp we have out there, the bigger localized impact it's going to have. I put up some numbers, for example, how much nitrogen is removed by a 1 acre kelp farm. And, if it's multi-acres, well, then it's even more. There are definitely limits, though. For example, all the towns and the county have specific aquaculture regions. So, going forward, we don't expect more than, say, I have the number of 5% of, I think, the Peconics maybe is set aside potentially for aquaculture. So that, that will have a big impact, but again, it'll be seasonal and it'll be localized. So, there's no doubt that seaweeds are a tool in the toolbox, but we'll want to have other tools to go with that.
Great, thanks. Our next question is for Michael Ciaramella. While you're walking up here, I'll read it. It's quite long. And it's from Ann Jones-Levine. Why is iodine on the food safety hazard? Is this based on the non-revisited RDH guidelines? And how would you remove or control iodine's bioavailability? The introduction of iodine into refined table salt during World War II, which uses chemical binders to keep it white and non-caking, to date is only about 10% bioavailable, which was added to prevent goiters. Okay, so this is quite the question. If iodine is a halogen that will detox the body from harmful halogens such as fluoride, chlorine, and bromine, does iodine's presence in seaweed and ocean life in general compete or neutralize other hazards that might cause potential issue. How much iodine do you typically find in seaweed? As a side note, cultures that consume larger amounts of iodine in their diet, how does this measure up to US? You have a lot of questions here. So can you speak generally about iodine and seaweeds and their effects?
Sure. Great question, because yes, traditionally iodine is an important component of our diet. The concern with seaweed, and there really is not a lot of real clear answers to this yet, is that some species of seaweed have extremely high levels of iodine, well above the recommended daily intakes, and there have been instances where there are thyroid issues due to excessive iodine intake. All right, and so for those species that have those incredibly high levels of iodine, there is that concern of, if we start increasing consumption, is it going to start to cause health issues down the road for some individuals? And so we don't necessarily have an answer to that just yet. And again, it's not all species. There are some post-processing methods for reducing the levels of iodine. They've seen some reductions with some of the water treatments, so the blanching and the steam blanching, where you can actually remove some of that iodine. But it's species dependent, and it really depends on exposure to the concentrations of seaweed that can be present in some seaweeds. One other way of dealing with that, and this is some great advice for dealing with any kind of contaminants in our foods, because almost all of our food has some level of contaminants, but most of the time they're regulated to ensure that they're below thresholds that would cause public health concern. But if you consume too much of any one food, right, you can be exposing yourself to higher concentrations and higher levels of various contaminants. So diversifying your diet is a great way to help limiting exposure. So especially off the bat, for those kelps or seaweeds that are have high iodine contents, you don't want to eat them 3 meals a day, 7 days a week, right? You want to limit the consumption of those products because of those potential health risks associated with what otherwise is an important component of your diet, right? So there are cases where there can be too much of a good thing.
Thank you.
Was there more to it?
Nope, I think that was good there. Again, if you have any questions, use the QR code. Our next question is for Tila Troge, and it's from Lauren. And Lauren would like to know, who are the Shinnecock kelp farmers and what do you do? Which is probably a very loaded question that could go on for hours, but let's see. Thank you, Tila.
So that's a great question. The Shinnecock kelp farmers are 6 women. We're all enrolled members of the Shinnecock Nation. We currently operate a sugar kelp hatchery as well as 3 separate sugar kelp farms. We have been doing this for a number of years now, 3 years, and we're really we do a lot. We educate, we teach, we show people, model different ways to combat the capitalism and inequities that we see in this region that we believe have led to some of the problems that we now see. And so we do a lot of different things. We consider ourselves to be water protectors and also land defenders. So we have a different arm that kind of works on preservation and demolishing homes that are at the highest points of the watersheds here for the Peconic and the Shinnecock Bay, starting to get some of those bathrooms to stop dumping human waste into our waters. And we formed kind of in a response to a situation where we had the New York State DEC was really harassing our men for exercising their Aboriginal rights to hunt and fish in Shinnecock Bay and Peconic Bay. And so we wanted to assert our sovereignty over the water in a very gentle way that is very healing and regenerative to the ecosystem. And again, just be models and leaders in implementing action, because it's really not for a lack of resources in this area that there's not actual implementation or action that is taken to mitigate some of the devastation that we see locally here because of the climate crisis. So it's a little bit of who we are. I do see that Fred Thiel has joined us, so maybe we could turn it over to him for closing remarks.
Okay, I think we could probably take one more question. And I'll give this question to Trevor Swope. Here we are. So based on the current industrial agricultural landscape, kelp-based fertilizer may never be the most potent or cheapest fertilizer on the market. What are the incentives for a farmer to use this input, other than an interest in protecting the environment? And do you see a future with widespread adoption of kelp-based fertilizer?
All right, that's an excellent question, and that's a question that we got a lot, especially as we, tried to shop our products out to farmers. Pretty much, if you look at kelp meal pound for pound next to manure or industrial fertilizer, it does not at all compete. It's really not a substitute for fertilizer. It has some great benefits as a fertilizer, but the other thing that it does that's really important is, you might have heard me use the word a couple times, biostimulant. So aside from giving a nice, NPK hit to the vegetation growing in that soil, it, almost more importantly, or just as importantly, gives a boost to all of the microbiological activity going on in the soil itself. So particularly in an organic farming model where you really are cultivating the health of the soil as much, if not more, than the plants growing in it, those biostimulant properties really can't be discounted, and it's really spectacular. The other thing that it does is it also changes the way that soil absorbs and retains water, so that also comes into play with nutrient uptake. And then in terms of, there was the other part of that question was, do I see widespread adoption as a possibility? Definitely, absolutely. Why not? I have to. But yeah, I mean, really, it's like it's, I mean, obviously here where it's a lot of like-minded people, but the conversation I was having earlier was just sort of, this is a tremendous resource that serves, so many purposes in terms of healing, cleaning the ocean, and then doing the same for the soil, regenerating, improving the nutrient content of the soil. So I don't know. I mean, my feeling is that like we have to, there's not really a choice. So I think that, yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to just, I hope you don't mind, Assemblyman Thiel, I'm just going to field one more question because I really want to know this myself. And it's addressed to anyone, and it's from Sarah Gordon. And maybe whoever wants to take a shot at it can. Our farm is building closed-loop nutrient cycling on Shelter Island for soil health through composting local diverted food waste, leaves, etc., and considering compost tea production as well. How might we add and integrate kelp fertilizer with these traditional compost applications? So I'm going to ask if you want to field that question, and then I'm sure a lot of you might. I'm sure Trevor might, and maybe Tila too, but would you like to address that question?
Just real quickly, and then not that I'm the expert.
Yeah.
I'll just say that we've worked with Macari Vineyard, and they've actually for years been composting kelp. Right before we got into the kelp game, they were getting it from the Northeast. So I think it can just be mixed into the compost pile, if you will, and I'm sure it can be. Yeah. So that's what I can say. But I mean, Macari Vineyards paid a lot of money every year because they saw that it worked well, and so they brought it in. They would compost it and use it on their vineyard. So. And that's, not having to go through any drying or grinding, but just, composting it naturally. So I think it can be brought right in there, and I'm sure there can be nuanced and perfected over time. But if other people want to jump in and answer.
And I'll also say that Stephen Stort would always, we had a Vortex brewer at Bridgehampton School where we added kelp to the compost tea mix. And we got fabulous results from that as well. Does anybody else? Yeah, I'm sure you have something to say.
The only thing I would add to that is that actually I left out a part of that last question, and that's that there was a question about like, is kelp meal seen as a a total substitute for fertilizer. And this makes a really good point of no, it doesn't. It only serves to improve existing sort of fertilizing techniques like composting, that kind of thing. So used in conjunction with those things, it's really spectacular. The one thing actually Edwina mentioned to me just now is if you are doing that, you want to know your sources. You know, if you are composting whole leaf kelp, really using any kind of kelp, you really want to know where it's coming from. There was a term that came up earlier, bioremediation, and that's a wonderful application for growing kelp, but you do want to be, there's kelp that can be so intensively used for bioremediation that you want to be thinking about if it's actually something you want in the soil. So it can go too far in that direction.
All right, one more comment before, and it's a quick one. So the Shinnecock kelp farmers have created a not-for-profit, and they are receiving donations. So if you're so inclined, it would be wonderful to help them out because they're doing amazing work and have been for millennia. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Assemblyman Fred Thiel to come on up and give us our closing remarks. Assemblyman Thiel has been a friend of Stony Brook, a friend of Southampton College, LIU, our community, and representing us in New York State for many, many years, since 1992 as an assemblyman?
95.
95.
Who's counting, really?
All right, okay. A long time, so he's a friend of us. So come, join us.
Well, thank you, Judy Ann, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I want to thank, first of all, I want to thank Food Lab for all the great work that they're doing, and I really appreciate being invited to provide some remarks at the conclusion of this conference, which I know is focused a lot on kelp, which I certainly will talk a little bit about. It's good to see Dr. Gobler here. I actually walked in just in time to hear Dr. Gobler say he was not the expert on something, which was unnerving to me, to be quite honest. But it's always good to see Dr. Gobler, and we all know all the great work that he's doing, the great research, really on the cutting edge of providing the knowledge that we need to be able to deal with water quality issues here across the East End. And, you know, again, my worlds are colliding together because Tila Troge is here also. She was speaking when I first came in, and, you know, we don't have a budget yet in Albany. I don't know if you've heard about that, but one of the things we're trying to also get into this year's budget is protection for unmarked graves for Native American burial grounds, which are, this is New York State is one of 4 states that doesn't have that protection. We passed a bill in the legislature to do that last year. It got vetoed, and we're trying to get it negotiated into the state budget. So I mentioned that we don't have a state budget, and that always gets me to, you know, there's the two most beautiful sights for me is, those of you that know me know that I like to walk a lot, and I walk along Long Beach, and one of the most beautiful sights for me is walking along Long Beach just at sunset. It's one of the great sunsets. People stop and they want to see the sunset there. It's a gorgeous vista. And the second most beautiful sight for me typically is seeing Albany in my rear view mirror. And so far I haven't been able to say that because we don't have a budget. And a lot of what I want to spend some time talking about today is really dependent on what happens with the state budget. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think is going to happen because things are starting to close, and you know, the budget sets the priorities for the states. That's what's important. And the two things I want to talk about today are really water quality and kelp, and the role that the state is playing, and to a greater degree what the role the state should be playing. You know, first and foremost, all of this depends on clean water. And we've had, you know, the disturbing trend over the last many decades of declining water quality, something we always took for granted. When I grew up, I've lived here all my life, and I grew up in Sag Harbor. We took water quality for granted. You know, it would be there forever, you know. the scallops that we would get in the fall would be there forever. You know, you could go wherever you wanted to go and dig clams. We took it for granted. And what we realized is that actions have consequences. And it is not forever unless we take care of it. And, you know, water quality has really become the #1 environmental issue here on the East End. Nothing else works here on the East End unless we have good water quality. Whether it's just our general quality of life, our environment, our surroundings, our economy, all depend on clean water. And that has been a real focus, certainly, for those of us that represent Long Island in the state legislature. You know, going back to 10 years ago when the first funding for the Water Technology Center at Stony Brook, where Dr. Gobler is doing such outstanding work to create new technologies, to remove nitrogen, to come up with innovative septic systems to help us remove nitrogen from our waters. I'm going to focus on just a couple of things. Dr. Gobler's funding for that center is also in this budget, but it is in good stead. So, but some of the things that we need to focus on, because you know, all decisions of government are ultimately decisions of money, and we have great plans. Every town has a water quality plan. The County of Suffolk has approved their sub-watershed plan with the outline of how we return our water quality, how we clean up our water quality. But it takes money, it takes resources. And you know, that is really one of the things that we're primarily focused on with the state budget in Albany right now. And I just got home late last night. We'll be going back on Sunday, and hopefully we're going to finish the budget next week. But, you know, first and foremost, we do have a sub-watershed plan for the County of Suffolk that is focused on septic waste and removing nitrogen. Our county executive has said nitrogen is public enemy #1 when it comes to water quality, and that's why Dr. Gobler's work is so critical. But we have the plan. We have the plan of what to do for over the next 40 or 50 years. We need the money to implement that plan. There's 360,000 individual septic systems that need to be upgraded. There's the need for funding for sewage treatment infrastructure. You know, if you read the local papers out here on the East End, you know, almost every community, at least in their central business district, is looking at the need for a sewage treatment. We just saw West Hampton Beach that has had success in getting the money to hook up to the county plant. But Southampton Village, East Hampton Village, Montauk, every one of these locations are looking at sewage treatment, and at least for their downtown business areas. So upgrading septic systems, upgrading sewage treatment costs a lot of money. And quite frankly, unless we do something different, we're not going to have those resources that we need to do it. So our county executive, Steve Ballone, you know, the county did the study. They had proposed a plan to create a water quality restoration fund for the County of Suffolk. The need between now and 2060 is $3.1 billion to upgrade septic systems, to provide the infrastructure that we need to remove nitrogen from our environment and restore our water quality. So we introduced a bill in Albany, which we are now trying to get included in the budget. And in fact, I'm going to break some news about that right now, because the county executive's plan, which you know, we put into state legislation, you know, for consideration in Albany, was basically a three-part plan. One is to take all of the existing sewer districts in the County of Suffolk, and most of them are in the West End. In fact, all of them are in the West End, but consolidate them into one district as far as the sewage treatment goes, but to have a wastewater district for all of Suffolk County. so that we have one entity that is focused on removal of nitrogen from septic waste. That's the first thing that this bill would do, would be to create that entity. The second part of the bill is to extend the existing 0.25% for drinking water protection, which the county has. That is set to expire in 2030. We would extend that until 2060. And the third part is the key, really, to implementing what we need for the sub-watershed plan and to provide the infrastructure we need. And that would be to add an additional 0.125% on the existing county sales tax and dedicate that in a dedicated fund, a water restoration fund, that would be used to upgrade all of these 360,000 septic systems that needed to be upgraded and to provide sewage treatment. 75% of the money would go to upgrade individual septic systems. You know, the county has an existing and the towns have an existing rebate program for septic systems, you know, basically to help you pay for the cost of upgrading your septic system. The problem is that, you know, there's 360,000 of them and we're doing hundreds each year. We need to do a lot more. You need the money to be able to do that. This fund would do that. It would generate over between now and 2060, in the early years, it would generate about $60 million a year and projected to be as much as $100 million after as we approach the year 2060. That is where the $3 billion would go. So three-part program to really gear everything up as far as removing nitrogen in our environment. And I should point out that the voters would have the ultimate say. This legislation that we're considering in Albany authorizes the county to create the fund, but ultimately the voters would get the choice because it's subject to mandatory referendum. So, you know, the news to break here today is literally last night at about 11 o'clock, the governor, the Senate, and the Assembly all agreed to put this bill in the budget. So, sometime in the next week, this is going to get approved, and then it will shift back to the county, and hopefully it will be on the ballot this November. You know, the state has a role to play in this also. We've been putting $500 million a year into a water quality infrastructure fund, and that's the money that's being used now largely for septic system upgrades. That's how the county program is actually being funded, is with those state dollars. We're looking to increase that amount from $500 million to $600 million in the budget, so that the state will be a partner with the county. And also, you know, as we know, the Community Preservation Fund, which just passed the $2 billion mark as far as raising funds on the East End. 20% of that fund now can be used for water quality. So collectively, we would have town, county, and state funding all partnering together to address the resources that we need to reverse the trends in water quality that we've begun, but that we need to step up. So that was one of the things I just wanted to bring up today and to talk about because, you know, the second part of what I want to talk about, which is Kelp and what we're trying to do in the state of New York. If you don't have good water quality, you know, you can't do Kelp, and Kelp is a part of that. You know, you can't restore scallops. You know, you can't reopen areas to shellfish. You can't do any of those things unless we improve water quality. Our quality of life, our environment, our economy all depends on clean water, and that needs to be a top priority so that things such as kelp farming can happen. And again, this sounds like I am the cheerleader for Dr. Gobler, but he deserves it. And that is, you know, through Stony Brook University, did the research that was necessary to show really the proof of concept, you know, that there is value, great value, in instituting and encouraging and incentivizing kelp farming here on Long Island. And I'd like to say, because of Dr. Gobler's work, that we were on the cutting edge when it comes to kelp, but we are not. And it's not his fault. It is the state's fault. We need to do more. Connecticut, Maine, in the New England area, they are far ahead of us when it comes to kelp farming and getting the benefits of this. And we are playing catch up. And that is something that we need to do, and we need to do it, quickly. Because as I'm sure has been reiterated by everybody who spoke today, kelp is one of those win-win situations. It provides economic opportunity because it is a commercially viable product. It provides options for our traditional marine industries here on the East End. I think of 50 years ago when the Hargraves, everybody thought they were crazy. Let's start growing grapes as an alternative for agriculture. We need to do something new. And it changed agriculture out here. And, everybody knows that our marine industries have been struggling. Commercial fishermen are struggling. Baymen are struggling. They're the endangered species. And we need other options, new ways to think about things. And kelp farming is one of those ways where individuals who live in that tradition of our marine industries can find a new way to provide economic opportunity on the water. So it is economically of critical importance. And of course, water quality, which I spoke about in the beginning, kelp removes nitrogen from the water, and it does it naturally. And Dr. Gobler, I'm going to say I'm not the expert because he is. But the kelp farming will help to remove nitrogen from our waters. We're going to spend, I just said, we're going to spend $3 billion removing nitrogen from our waters coming from septic waste. This is a way that we can generate economic activity, create jobs, and improve water quality all at the same time. The first step we took was in Suffolk County and dealing with the existing SCALP program, the program in the Peconic and Gardner system that is run by the county, where they were put together a plan and lease. There are state waters that are delegated to be administered by the county, but for over 10 years now, the county has had a program where they lease bottomlands, and those bottomlands have been used for shellfish cultivation. We wanted to extend that program and provide kelp seaweed, really. It's broader. Today we're talking about kelp, and a lot of focus is on sugar kelp, but the bill that we did actually would allow for all seaweed because there's other opportunities out there also. And 2 years ago, we passed that bill for the Peconic Gardner system, and the county is in the process of hopefully implementing that bill. And that was a very, very good first step, is to allow for kelp farming and the leasing of state bottomlands to foster that industry. And I'm talking, today about legislation, because I'm on the state level, about state bottomlands. If they're town trustee lands or other bottomlands, private bottomlands, they don't need this legislation. But there's a lot of state bottomlands out there. So that bill was approved. There was so much interest in kelp farming because of what we did with the legislation in the Peconics that there was interest in extending that same legislation across the Marine District for all state bottomlands. And we put that bill together last year. It passed both houses of the state legislature, but it got vetoed by the governor last year. The governor said it was premature. Let us wait and see what happens in the Peconic Gardners system first. And I'm a little less patient than the governor because, as I said, I think we're behind. It's not premature, it's late, and we should be focusing on doing this now. I think there was resistance to this, within the Department of Environmental Conservation because The second bill, unlike the first bill where all of the work was delegated to the county, the DEC would have had to do the work. And the DEC, to be fair to them, has been underfunded and understaffed for quite some time now. So those are things we need to remedy, and one of the things we're remedying in this budget is providing more staff for the Department of Environmental Conservation. The other thing that we're looking at with this legislation, because we're going to pursue it again this year, is in meeting with some of the advocates, for kelp farming, is that, DEC is pretty much a regulatory agency. They regulate what goes on the water. They're not so much of an advocate. And there's the thought really that maybe the State Department of Agriculture and Markets should be involved with this also, just as they advocate for land-based cultivation and agriculture. Maybe they have a role to play here in this legislation, so that all of the burden of this for DEC, which would still have a role because they have a regulatory role, but as far as promoting and providing advocacy, perhaps the Department of Ag and Markets should have a role to play in helping to promote this industry. So we're trying to get past the budget. We're almost done, and then we're going to focus on legislation, and this kelp legislation is going to be part of that. So we realize that we're going to have to do something different if we're not going to get a veto from the governor again. One of the things we did was to provide more staffing for the Department of Environmental Conservation, but we're also looking at providing a role for the Department of Ag and Markets, so that there's a state agency and someone in state government that is helping to promote and is an advocate for this industry and just doesn't view it as a regulatory role. So, I'm going to conclude there. I just want to say that, I'm not an expert in any of this. The only science I know is political science. But, I know when something's good for the East End and good for this community, and promoting this industry, promoting kelp, is good for this area. So in my role as a state representative, working with Senator Palumbo and Assembly Member Giglio, who represents Riverhead, and West, we're going to work to try to take the obstacles away from the future growth of this industry, because it's important for our environment, it's important for our economy, it's important for our way of life. And I applaud all of the entrepreneurs and the pioneers that have been out there, making things happen and beginning this new industry. You're doing, obviously it's your business, but you're also doing, providing benefits to the community. And I just want to conclude by thanking Judy Ann and Food Lab for being here to help promote it also, and to bring more attention to this, because there's a great future here, and we just need to kind of actually in the case of state government, just get out of the way and let it happen. So thank you for having me here today. If anybody has any questions, I'm certainly glad to answer any questions. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions? Oh, we have some questions.
Yes.
Thank you for securing this campus. I live in Shinnecock Hills, and I appreciate your saving it. My one question is, what is the wastewater management system on this campus? Because I have a well.
Yeah, we've always looked to, obviously I'd like to see more things happening on this campus. I think I've made my position rather clear on that. But, related to that, is that there would be the need to upgrade the method. There would be the need for a sewage treatment plant on this campus if it's ever going to be restored. And that was understood even when LIU owned the campus, and there were, 1,000 students that were, going to school here, and a good portion of them when it was a residential campus. So, right now, I think, it's septic systems here. There's no sewage treatment here, but any upgrade, it's an excellent point. Any upgrade of this campus, which hopefully will ultimately occur, would also require, and one of the expenses of it would be to provide sewage treatment.
But not till then, because it's all going into the bay.
Well,
Shinnecock Bay. Yeah.
it is,
Can I just say, it's kind of ironic that we have the marine sciences here,
yeah,
and yet, in all these years, there hasn't been an effort to mitigate all the waste. And also, the development here. For example, the project on the canal, there's no wastewater barrier, so all the fertilizers are now going into the Shinnecock Canal.
mhm.
And that hasn't been mitigated either, and yet the campus is only a few miles from it.
Understood. Again, I've been trying to use my best efforts to get money devoted to this campus. And, we've got 41 buildings on this campus, and 17 of them have been condemned. And there needs, in any, upgrade, it takes money. And, perhaps as part of, what we've talked about with the water restoration system, that will help to provide some funding for this campus. But, at the moment, the level of activity here is probably the least it's probably been in 20 years. There's a lot less wastewater going in here now, unfortunately being generated, I should say, but then there was, when LIU actually ran the campus. But your point is well taken, and it's been identified as a need, for the future of this campus.
And the canal was developed just 2 years ago. All new buildings, everything on that land is being washed right into the canal.
Yeah, you're gonna have to talk to the town about that one.
I'll talk to you about it.
Well, you can, but the town has jurisdiction over it. That was the locally approved project. Listen, that's why you need money to do these projects, and that's why, we're spending the time that we're spending here, trying to provide funding, to provide incentives for all of these sewage and septic upgrades that are necessary.
Well, can you write into the legislation to prevent developments like those motel townhouses that directly?
Those are local decisions, and they should remain local decisions. See, I don't want the state of New York deciding what happens, with local land use decisions. Those are decisions for the town to make, and, the planning board and the zoning board are just down the road. They meet every Thursday.
You know I went to all.
Yeah.
You have a question too?
I don't have a question, I just, on behalf of the Old Guard of Food Lab, and I just wanted to say thank you, Assemblyman Beal, and I just wanted to give a super shout out, not only to everybody who came here, but to Judy Ann. Put the whole thing together, and I think you've done a great job, so.
Judy Ann is a force of nature. I learned a long time ago, so it's a pleasure to be working with her again here now that she's on. Oh yeah, well, I thought that was implied, actually. So thank you. Any other questions? If not, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jeff. You are a mentor. So thank you. But please do stick around. We have such amazing people. Lots of questions, lots of things to learn. I did order some food because you must all be starving, and I figured better to do it after to keep you in here. So please feel free to go out. There are tables. Sit down. You have badges with your names. Go seek out people, talk, do. Also, we have an open house at the greenhouse, and I'm sure that Dr. Gobler and Mike Duell will be very, very happy if you unload us of some plants, because the kelp is ready to go in. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, speakers, and come and carry on the conversation outside. So thank you very much.